all good. I got it though, so it turned out good. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, every one of you. Longtime folks, new visitors here for the first time today. It is so good to see you, to hear you, to feel your presence back in this space that missed you for so long. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Providence and to this beautiful day that we have been given. May we make the very most of it starting now together. Oh my goodness, there is so much to share this morning. I have to just start right away here with the invocation. A lot of you know that this service is the last in a series that began 2 years ago, actually a little over 2 years ago, as we started our 300th anniversary celebration. And so much has happened and so much has changed since then, and some things we have determinedly kept up or even improved. Back when I preached my very first sermon on this, we had just begun to research our church's history regarding race in this state that was so deeply involved in the international slave trade. Back then, we thought we would do 3 services, one neatly on each century. But since then, our thinking evolved, and we ended up with more history sermons shaped by themes rather than centuries, which allowed us, for example, to look at the evolution of our covenants and theology a few months ago over time, and the role of the changing roles of women in our churches. Now, finally, having done a lot of additional research, we have this service concluding the series, exploring in particular our church's history with race and the business of slavery. And as we might expect this morning, we have uncovered truths that we might have hoped not to find, and also truths that we can be very glad to know. I want to offer my endless thanks to the History Committee, who I invite now to rise so you can see who they are, because they've put an enormous amount of work into this. History Committee, I see you. You have to stand up. Robert O., stand up. Thank you. And is Peter Larman here? Cheryl Bartholomew, I did not see you. Cheryl's standing in the aisle. Where's Peter? Peter's over there. Yeah, this church is so big, it takes a while to figure out where everybody is. Yeah, they've done an incredible job. My thanks to them for their vision, and to the Prudential Committee for authorizing funds to pay for the research necessary for this investigation, and especially to Peter Larman, who is sitting over there, and the Brown University researcher Tracy Picard, for their boundless patience and passion in helping us all learn what we can about our own story. Phyllis, you did not stand up, did you, with the History Committee? You did? Stand up again, because I didn't see it, and I'm worried other people didn't. There's Phyllis. I don't know if I'm missing somebody. You're masked, it's hard to see. If I'm missing somebody, I don't want you to be upset. I want you to just stand and be recognized. Am I missing anybody else? Okay. Who? Yes, Susan Fisher. I didn't see her. She's at home. Hi, Susan Fisher. Thank you for everything you've done on this project. So I want to start with a story about now, not about the past. When I was starting to plan for this series of sermons, I was also, as many of you know, beginning to build a connection with Pastor Howard Jenkins over at Bethel African Methodist Episcopal, AME, Church. And 2 years ago, I began that first history sermon by saying, my friend, Pastor Howard Jenkins of Bethel AME Church over on Rochambeau Avenue said to me recently, knowing ourselves and each other means knowing our history. He is so right. And then I went on to preach the first sermon, and for some reason that wasn't fully clear to me, I felt compelled to explore not only our own church's history during that first 100 years, but also the beginning of Bethel's history. Even though our connection was still pretty new, and who knew how far it would really go, whether our congregations would really build the lasting relationship that Pastor Jenkins and I hoped we would. So I did include a paragraph about the founding of the AME Church in America. You may not remember it, but it was there. When I got to First Jews' story in the late 1700s, I said, meanwhile, down in Philadelphia, a man named Richard Allen had bought himself out of slavery in his early 20s and become a Methodist Episcopal preacher. Repelled by the required segregation of black members in the congregation he was serving, he left, and in 1787 he established the Free African Society, a mutual aid society to assist fugitive enslaved people and newcomers to the city. This was the forerunner of what would become the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They purchased a blacksmith shop, which was the first home of the organization. In 1794, the Free African Society in Philadelphia was officially incorporated as the first Bethel AME Church. And that's the end of what I said back then. Then I went on to talk about our own Reverend Dr. Enos Hitchcox. He was our 5th minister in this church. His abolitionist writing, which was presented as a letter to a Philadelphian around the same time in 1790. And maybe that was enough of a link so that it seemed to fit. But the thing is, to me, it didn't entirely fit. But the work with Bethel felt important. And the imperative to know our history in the context of knowing ourselves and each other meant to me that in talking about race and slavery and this church back in the day, I should mention Bethel's roots too. And so I did. And I thought that was the end of the story. Until now. So with that cliffhanger and without further ado, let's join in singing our first hymn.
Right after we light our chalice.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Roger, for keeping me on track. You can see how excited I am for today. Lee, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lee Rodman. I'm our worship associate this morning. Please join me in the words of our chalice lighting.
This light burns also in our hearts,
and it guides our path towards harmony, justice, and hope for all.
I have to stop doing that. I've skipped the chalice lighting twice now in the last couple weeks, so I need to get called back. Thank you very much. But now we get to sing. I'm so excited to say this. Our first hymn in 2 years. We get to sing it together, masked. But we get to sing Morning is Broken, number 38. Can we rise in body or spirit and sing out masked as we are able? wondered if having to do it masked would really step on how it felt, and it did not step on it for me. My God, that felt good. So does this. It's the time for our greeting, our chance to stand up as we are able, turn around, wave, greet the people sitting near us, greet the people sitting all the way across the congregation or up in the balcony. So let's stand and turn and wave, call out greetings, blow kisses, do air hugs. Air hugs to everybody from me. And everybody in the balcony, so good to see you. Choir, so good to see you. Our tech team and our music director and, oh my gosh, everybody. And let's, can you guys point to the right camera? It's that one, right in front of the guy who's pointing down. Hi, everybody at home. Hi, everybody at home. We are so glad you're with us in spirit, and we miss you. And now I am excited to introduce Paul and Gail Brule. Paul is chairing our commitment drive, which is starting in April, and it is finishing in April this year. So we're giving you a little extra lead time to get ready, because we're not doing the usual long scoop at the end. It's 1 month, tight, lean, awesome, and it's starting in advance with this sort of preemptive thing. This wonderful message from the Brules. Thank you so much for doing this morning.
Good morning. I'm Gail Brule.
And I'm Paul Brule. Gail and I would like to share with you why our church community here is so important to us. Our story goes back to the summer of 1977 after meeting in Paris as American students abroad, where we learned that one of us was a Rhode Islander and the other was from Massachusetts. We continued our relationship stateside. We were both a bit uncomfortable with the different churches we had grown up with, and we were both open to finding something new.
And then, while out on a date, one Saturday night, while attending a performance of the Paris House Players across the way in the auditorium, during the intermission, we saw that Tom Alverin would be holding a service that Sunday morning celebrating the religious thoughts of Albert Einstein.
That became our first time in the meeting house. It was a wonderful experience in the truest sense of the word. But amongst all the wonders that occurred to me that morning, one that did not occur to me was that I would be getting married in this meeting house in December of 1980. And it certainly did not cross my mind that first Sunday morning that Gail and I would have two very wonderful children, both of whom would go through the church school program here, the coming of age program, as well as the high school youth group.
And happily, our youngest will be celebrating her own marriage right here in this meeting house in the middle of May.
Over the years here at our church, and by that I mean not only the church of Gail and I, but the church of all of us here at our church, Gail and I grew and learned not only as a married couple, but as a mom and a dad, and in so many other ways. We grew and learned in ways that were guided by the thoughts that we heard here in this meeting house over the decades. We grew and learned various lessons, but perhaps the most important lesson is that we learned how to become better people.
And we learned those lessons from the people that were here with us, whether it was while we taught Sunday school or working with different people in various roles, such as the Prudential Committee, the Finance Committee, and many other parts of our community.
But we're not done growing and learning, and neither are you. And since no one else is going to do this for us, we have to arrange and provide for ourselves how we are going to continue to grow and learn.
We want to continue to grow and learn right here, and for us to do that, we need to provide not just our best intentions, but we also need to provide the tangible realities that make our church possible. Everything from keeping the lights on to ensuring the building and so many other financial needs. And we all provide for that through the annual pledge drive. So Paul and I are here asking you to please take the steps necessary to provide for our community here at our church. And yes, that means providing for your own self, and yes, for those essential others who are part of the process of you becoming a better person because of what it is that we share here.
So please look around and see what has been created here, not just the lovely meeting house, but the coming together of wonderful people. Please understand and appreciate what it takes to make that happen. And then please help yourself and the rest of our community to keep that going. And part of that involves the annual pledge drive of generosity, of which Gail and I are happy to be a part of. We will do our part by making a generous pledge. Please pledge as thoughtfully and as generously as you can. Thank you.
Now, can we rise in body or spirit and join together in reading our church covenant? We, the members of the First Unitarian Church in Providence, with respect for the worth and dignity of each person, with wonder at the light we know by many names, and with gratitude for our deep connection to each other and to the larger web of existence, covenant to walk together in our search for truth, seeking the paths of wisdom, compassion, and justice.
This is the time where we share our joys and our sorrows. And since you're all coming back, a reminder, you can write your joys and sorrows in this book anytime. It's located in the back corner of the sanctuary. And I have to say, I myself am filled with joy to the brim today to see so many of you on such a glorious day with a choir and singing hymns. It feels like church before COVID, and it feels good. And speaking of joy, a candle of joy for a great birthday party with my extended family. There was no name, but happy birthday. A candle of joy for singing hymns again. A candle of gratitude, joy, and a deep breath of relief to announce that last week we officially adopted our daughter. We celebrated with a trip to Disney World, so our princess-loving 6-year-old was very pleased. Thank you for all the well wishes, and thank Elsa too, I'm sure. This is from Dana and Colin. A candle of joy for a visit to see my parents, a reminder of what matters. And the sun and fun was good for the soul. A candle to remember the birthdays of Dr. Van Erp, 11 years ago, and Augusto Romano, 104 years ago. This is from Peter Van Erp and Chiara Romano. A candle of joy in celebration of my mother's 85th birthday and to her continued health and happiness. That is from Marianne Rogers. A candle for Tim, remembering his husband, for Terry's family, remembering her, and a candle for the Ukraine. A candle of sorrow for the continuous war in Ukraine. I am especially sad for the deaths of innocent people and the destruction of their country in this war with Russia. A candle of gratitude and warmth. I guess it's a mixed bag of a candle. Our interim music director, Jeff Allard, is going on to other career opportunities awaiting him, and we do wish him the very best as he takes leave of us at the end of this church year. And with that, a candle of gratitude and welcome again to Beth Armstrong as she pinch hits as our interim music director for next year. There will be a time of celebration and thanksgiving for Jeff later this spring. A candle of healing for Sina Pounder as she waits for a care plan to deal with a carcinoma. A candle of wellness for Susan Hurd, who ended up in the ER just after being in the same room as Peanut Oil. A candle of sympathy for Aubrey Atwater at the passing of her mother Nina on Thursday evening. A candle of sympathy for Ken Matson at the passing of his father Elmer on Friday morning. And finally, a candle of sympathy and care for Dolores Braca for the passing of John Braca, who died on March 17th. Please, all of you, plan to stay this morning as there will be a celebration of John's life this afternoon at 12:30 in this very room. The entire family welcomes all of you. I'd like us now to prepare for prayer and meditation, and to remind you at the end of the meditation, when we have that moment of silence, if you've lost someone this year, please do stand with us or raise your hand in witness of that loss during our time of silence together. Please take a deep breath with me. And again. And one more. This is called We Gather to Remember, which I've adapted from Nicole McKay. We gather to remember those who could not grow old and those forced to grow old long before their time. We gather to mourn and grieve the people, the stories, the loved ones, all of our losses, and the futures that could have been. We gather to do the hard work of facing the difficult realities in our present and in our past, where there is slavery, violence, hatred, and war. We gather to hold space for silence as we try to make meaning of our history, to help us work for peace and justice today. We gather to rekindle our hope for the future by seeing in one another our shared humanity as we join in a concerted commitment for a better tomorrow. Amen.
This morning's reading is an excerpt from the poem Redemption. Excuse me, forgot the mask. This morning's reading is an excerpt from the poem Redemption by British Somali poet Warsan Shah. Take 1 pint of water, add a ½ pound of sugar, the juice of 8 lemons, the zest of a ½ lemon. Pour the water from one jug, then into the other several times. Strain through a clean napkin. Grandmother, the alchemist, you spun gold out of this hard life, conjured beauty from the things left behind, found healing where it did not live. discovered the antidote in your own kitchen, broke the curse with your own 2 hands. You passed these instructions down to your daughter, who then passed it down to her daughter. My grandma said, "Nothing real can be threatened." True love brought salvation back into me. With every tear came redemption, and my torturer became my remedy. So we're gonna heal. We're gonna start again.
Our next hymn, Creative Love, Our Thanks We Give, number 289. Can we rise in body or spirit and sing out again? I'm starting with the more general, so we have some shared context as foundation, and then I'll narrow down as I go towards the more particular and individual, because it is people, after all, that comprise a church. A couple of things we need to know, and we may know already. The triangle trade is a term we may be familiar with, but it is crucial for our understanding in today's sermon, so I'm starting with that. The name describes the shape of slavery's shipping routes. Ships from the east coast of the United States took sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum across the Atlantic to Europe, and then brought textiles, rum, and manufactured goods south to West Africa, and then took enslaved people across back to the Americas, where they were exchanged for cotton, sugar, and so forth, which then got brought up to New England and sailed across the ocean again in a restarted cycle. Rhode Island was especially dominant in this trade, not only trading in enslaved people directly, but also in a lot of rum distilleries that operated here, making a kind of concentrated rum called Guinea rum, which, because it was so concentrated, was cheaper to transport, and then they could dilute it with water upon its arrival in Europe for consumption, and cotton. Many of the factory buildings hereabouts received raw cotton shipped from down south, and this was particularly true after the cotton gin was introduced to the harvesting process in 1794. Mills up here wove the cotton into a kind of rough fabric that was called, and this was the name, Negro cloth, much of which was then often shipped back down south for the clothing of enslaved people. It was all literally interwoven, the fabric of society and commerce in and around Providence. And all this means it was part of the context for those years here in this church. One other important bit of context is that this is part of what motivated many Rhode Islanders to fight for independence in the Revolutionary War. They wanted free trade. They wanted this highly lucrative triangle to be free of limitations imposed by England that allowed trade only with or through other British colonies. And at the same time, it was impossible to pay attention to all this talk of liberty as an essential human right without considering slavery in that light. And this created, at the time, some hopeful opportunities. Over 100 black people in Rhode Island won their freedom during the Revolutionary War, some by serving in the army with the promise of freedom for their service, a promise that was many times honored by the government then. And right after the end of the war, Rhode Island passed one of the first and most impactful laws for the freeing of enslaved people, the March 1st, 1784 Gradual Emancipation Act. But it was complicated. Enslaved people born before that date, March 1st, 1784, would remain enslaved for life. But those born after that date to enslaved parents would be free if they reached the age of 21 if boys and 18 if girls. Even that limited and gradual emancipation was not fully upheld. Newport merchants in particular just ignored the law. Even after it was strengthened in 1787 to ban Rhode Island natives from participating in the slave trade under any terms, many defied the legislation. Some estimates are as high as 40,000 enslaved people were transported by Rhode Islanders to the Caribbean after 1787. So life remained very tough for black people here. Most freed individuals remained bound in white households or held the hardest and poorest occupations with little or no social mobility possible, and little or no acceptance from many white people who continued to expect service from black people at little or no cost. Rights and opportunities came and went. In 1822, the right of black men to vote in Rhode Island was rescinded, regardless of whether they met the property requirement then in place for voting. And their right to vote was not restored until 1843. The Hardscrabble race riot in 1826 and the Snowtown race riot in 1831 allowed poor white people who were increasingly being channeled into low-wage factory work to vent their frustration by destroying black neighborhoods, both businesses and homes. And not a single rioter was ever punished. All this is general background, but it is also particular to us because our church, across all those decades, was very much a congregation of the most privileged, very much captains of industry, very often either directly or indirectly the industries tied to slavery. And while people then may have drawn distinctions around their involvement, for instance, differentiated between owning a slave ship and owning a rum distillery, The two were not the same, but they were inextricably bound and mutually perpetuating. And we moderns, at least, have to own the connections we see now for what they were then. There is so much to be grateful for in the history and works and evolution of this church, where there is also reckoning for us to do. We certainly have the strength to do it, to consider and incorporate the ways slavery touched or shaped some of who we were then, which makes it part of our heritage now and part of our work now. And it hurts. It hurts to know that our beloved church is not free of taint. We wish it was. We wish it was as beautiful and pure in its history as this faith deserves and calls us to be. And to be sure, there were instances of goodness, faithfulness, courage also along the way, which helps. But for all the ways and times we weren't what we should have been, it is honest and healing to recognize our imperfections. And not just recognize our failures, but use this journey of discovery and reckoning to find ways to do better now than we did then. And it's in that spirit and belief that I am preaching this morning. None of our early leaders were directly involved in slaving voyages, but many were indirectly involved, investing in those businesses of sea trade and rum, which were, as we know, integral to the triangle trade. The land donated for our first meeting house by Captain Daniel Abbott, he was a wealthy rum distiller. Our second minister, John Bass, invested in a rum distillery. A number of our prominent families had members living in the South and the Caribbean to help manage slavery-related industries in sugar and later in cotton, which in turn motivated some of them to be strong advocates for the Revolutionary War, as I've already mentioned. Samuel Nightingale Jr., who was also known here as Deacon Nightingale, was very involved in rum distilling. He was a treasurer of the town of Providence, and he was also a treasurer for our church's Benevolent Congregational Society, which controlled all the money for this congregation from about 1770 to 1866. Their financial management was entitled and effective. All the original executive committee members of the Benevolent Congregational Society here owned enslaved people. Once upon a time, 1794, our church owned all the land from this corner all the way to Hope Street, courtesy of the Benevolent Society. And that is also the group who purchased the area over at Swan Point Cemetery, where many of our ministers and some early members are now buried. Prominent businessmen, some were members of this church, some were not, used to buy pews here at First U. And interestingly, also in other churches, St. John's Episcopal and Beneficent and others. There was this complex, tightly woven tapestry of business, society, and power, which ruled then. Some businessmen, including some members of our church, were even members of an anti-abolitionist society to protect the status quo. By and large, the same men who ran Providence also ran this church. And though I've named only men so far, there was an aspect of this that tied into the women leaders here at First U as well. For instance, the Providence Employment Society was founded by female church members, including the then minister's wife, in 1837. And you've heard our wonderful member and history scholar Phyllis Cole speak about this group. They were trying to ensure paid work and support for the poor. But part of their efforts to ensure employment for the poor was to set them making, quote, coarse cloth for a purchaser in the South. That's one of the historic records we drew on. Coarse cloth for a purchaser in the South, which inescapably suggests that the workers were making Negro cloth. We cannot help but see what they were perhaps able to blind themselves to at the time. Impoverished women, both white and black, earning a very low wage, put to work using cotton picked by enslaved people in the South to make fabric to clothe those very enslaved people. The ostensible benevolence of the charity perpetuating the markets and institutions of slavery. But what we know isn't just about the institutions. We have learned a lot about individuals in the last couple years of research. Reverend Cotton, Jabez Bowen, and Anna Bowen. I mentioned in that very first history sermon that Reverend Cotton, who was this church's very first minister, started in 1728, served almost 25 years. He grew the church and extended its membership to include Native people and people of color. From Reverend Cotton's record, we know that in 1729 or 30, a servant named Elizabeth, who was the daughter of a black man and a white woman, was baptized into the congregation. And we can tell that baptizing people of different races and heritages was something that Reverend Cotton did intentionally and with some degree of courage. His notes tell us that on Christmas Day, 1742, he baptized and welcomed into covenant Anna, who he describes in his notes as, quote, the Negro woman servant of Colonel Jabez Bowen, and Hannah Newfield, who he says was, quote, a free Indian woman, unquote. Reverend Cotton includes in his notes from that day the text he preached that morning, which was Acts chapter 10, verses 34 to 35. Then Peter began to speak to them. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. What we didn't know 2 years ago was who was Anna, the Negro woman servant of the church member, Colonel Jabez Bowen, and for that matter, who was Colonel Jabez Bowen? There was a lot of vague language used in reference to slaves and servants and service back then in New England, and I believe this must be because of the discomfort white people must have been constantly choking down at the horrific realities of their slave-based society and economy. Servant just sounds so much better. But Anna Bowen wasn't a servant. She was an enslaved person. And she lived out the rest of her life in service to Jabez Bowen, who was one of the prominent businessmen of his day, and he co-owned the slave ship Prudent. And while it may have been courageous back then for a predominantly white church to welcome people of color into covenant and membership, many slaveholders did believe that providing baptism and church membership was a redemptive act, even a mitigation of slaveholding. Church membership cannot be mistaken for equality or freedom. Anna Bowen was buried in the Newman Congregational Church graveyard in East Providence, and her gravestone is broken and badly deteriorated, making the inscription largely illegible, but we know what it says because it was also recorded in the Rhode Island Cemetery database. A Negro servant to Colonel Jabez Bowen, aged about 80 years. Thou a good master, I was a good slave. I now rest from labor and sleep in my grave. The extreme dependence of Rhode Island's economy on the slave trade is maybe why abolitionism here among the members of this congregation was sometimes present, but never dominant. You may remember that I spoke a couple years ago about Reverend Dr. Enos Hitchcock, our fifth minister, and his wife, to help you remember, his wife was the one whose letter I quoted a couple months ago in my sermon about ministers' wives. She was the one who got very salty about a preacher she couldn't stand. She felt that his chief claim to fame was the pomade in his hair. He was providing some pulpit coverage for Reverend Hitchcock, who was away serving with the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. I can see you kind of remember her. Reverend Hitchcock was known, among other things, for his work to establish a free public school system in Providence and for his abolitionism. In 1788, Reverend Hitchcock became a member of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery and the relief of free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage. That was their whole name. We think Unitarian Universalist is a lot. The Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery and for the relief of free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage. The Pennsylvania Society. But not here in Providence, where his ministry was bound to so many families dependent upon the business of slavery for their wealth. When Reverend Hitchcock died, he held a great deal of money that was invested in the same banks and insurance firms that the church's captains of industry controlled. And he did nonetheless spell out his abolitionist beliefs in his 1790 book, Memoirs of the Bloomsgrove Family, a series of essays that were presented as letters to a friend in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is a great example of that effect of America's dwelling on the principle of liberty that had the effect that had on so many who saw the impossibility of a free nation holding slaves. I cannot forbear, Reverend Hitchcock wrote, to express my astonishment at the inconsistency between the love of liberty which prevails in our country and the practices of many individuals in enthralling their fellow creatures. Americans can write with precision upon the principles of liberty, and yet many who can defend their own rights with one hand are extending the other for the purpose of enslaving a part of their own species. This is surely departing from the golden rule of doing as we would have done unto. How incompatible this commerce is with the character of a Christian people. What we've known about Reverend Hitchcock personally in terms of race was that he purchased an 11-year-old black boy, Caesar Hitchcock, and freed him, though we don't have any evidence for when that emancipation happened. Caesar remained with the Hitchcock family for the rest of his life. When Reverend Hitchcock died, he left a financial trust for Caesar. When Caesar died, he was buried next to Hitchcock in Pastor's Rest, which is the area reserved only for clergy and their immediate family, at the First Unitarian grounds over in Swan Point Cemetery. His gravestone reads, "To the memory of Caesar Hitchcock, man of color, who died on the 10th day of September, A.D. 1833. The religious example and pious instructions which he received in the family of the late," this is all on his gravestone, "on the family of the late Dr. Enos Hitchcock, with whom he lived many years, had an abiding influence upon him through life and rendered him an acceptable member of the Christian church. In all his course he exhibited an exemplary faithfulness, integrity, and uprightness, surpassed by none." All those abouts, aged about 65 years, aged about 80 years, no one knew or cared to figure out those details. People stolen into slavery were not allowed to retain their identity or traditions. No birthdays were celebrated. No record remained of all they were when their lives began. It is in the saddest crumbs of information, a household property list that includes human beings, financial assessments quantifying enslaved human value, sometimes even just the incongruous names given enslaved people, that we learn now what we can. Sometimes their lives are most fully documented in stone. So Caesar Hitchcock was about 65 years when he left this life. And his epitaph underlines the circumstances of that life. He was faithful, honorable, upright, not of himself, but because of the examples and instructions showered upon him by Reverend Dr. Hitchcock, who made Caesar an acceptable Christian. Reverend Hitchcock's will explicitly affirms that Caesar had been freed, even while it calls him my faithful black man, Caesar. And for the bequest provided in that will, Caesar had to apply to the church treasurer twice a year to secure cash payments from his share of bank stock, which was held in trust for him. Caesar's receipts for those payments are signed with an X, which is a surprising signature given Reverend Hitchcock's instruction and commitment to public education. When Caesar died, however, he did have some property, which he bequeathed to his friends. Census records show that Samuel Nightingale and his sons' families, most of whom were very active in this congregation, had both enslaved and free people of color working in their households. Speaking of names that tell us so much, we turn now to Joseph and Elizabeth Nightingale and Nimble Nightingale. Nimble. The Nightingale family owned an ornate mansion that is just a few blocks from here. Their great wealth came from indirect and direct involvement with the slave trade and the triangle trade. Elizabeth's husband, Joseph, co-owned the slave ship Providence, of all names, as if divine will had anything to do with the business of slavery. Joseph and Elizabeth Nightingale were highly influential and longtime leaders in our congregation. Elizabeth donated some of the beautiful communion silver set we now have. Some enslaved people in their household were admitted to communion here, and it's not 100% clear whether that's more about baptism or more about membership and participation in an ongoing way. But a number of their enslaved people were admitted to communion here, one of whom was Nimble Nightingale, who was admitted to communion in this congregation in January 1776, of all years, just as the nation's calls for liberty and independence were reaching their apex. But Nimble served also as a slave serving the Clark and Nightingale trading firm, and town records confirm that Nimble Nightingale was eventually freed, along with Bristol Nightingale. These manumissions required formal hearings where the slave owners had to come and testify that the people being freed would not become a financial drain on the town. And that's how we know what we know about many of the people who were freed. When Nimble Nightingale died in 1826, age about 66 years, he was honored in newspaper notices as a godly and well-respected man. But he was still identified as a servant to John Innes Clark of Clark and Nightingale. And he was given a pauper's burial by the town of Providence. We should keep the names of the many enslaved by this family that was so important in the life of this church. The white family members' names are engraved in our records, our membership books, the silver that they donated. These are the other names that we have not heard and never read. Nimble Nightingale's two spouses, Catherine and Candace. Cudge Nightingale, Joseph Nightingale, named for his enslaver. Joshua Nightingale, Nancy Nightingale, Holly Nightingale. I already mentioned Bristol Nightingale. Bristol's son Sam was baptized by this church. And there was also Bristol Nightingale Jr. and Cato Nightingale and Quam Nightingale, who apparently was able to purchase his freedom from the firm of Clark and Nightingale. And finally, there was Dorcas Nightingale, identified as servant girl to the long-serving deacon and church treasurer and town treasurer Samuel Nightingale Jr. Dorcas Nightingale was released from slavery in 1796. So many enslaved people have been part of this church, tied literally to our history than we ever knew, especially so many Nightingales, also so many Bowens whose names we have not known. Sylvia, Flora, Pompey, another Quam, Prince, Primus, and Bess Bowen, two of whose children were baptized by the church in 1785. Judah, or maybe Judith, because the handwritten record there is hard to read. Primus Jr., Jane, Sylvia, another Sylvia, and Isaac Bowen, all of whom I am grateful to say were eventually released from slavery by Colonel Bowen. There is so much more than I could possibly capture in one sermon or 10, but there is one more story that I have to share with you, the story of one of our sextons from many years ago, a man of remarkable gifts and character. We have just researched and figured out his story very recently, mostly in the last month. His name has come down through time and the church chronicles as Black Dan. But we looked for him and found him. And I hope we will only call him by his name from this day on. Daniel Nelson Morse. Daniel Morse was born in the South, but we can't find evidence of his status as having been enslaved or freed or born free. A church memoirist wrote in 1945 that our white church members shielded Mr. Morse from slave catchers. But we can't find any record within or beyond our archives that confirms the story. What we do know is that he came to Providence in 1837, which is when he first appears on record as sexton here. Daniel Morse married Phoebe Ann, who was born Phoebe Ann Phillips in North Kingston to two enslaved parents. Phoebe's father was released from slavery in 1789, and he saved enough money to purchase the freedom of Phoebe's mother. So Phoebe Ann and her brother John were raised as free people, but with a very immediate experience of the systems of slavery on their family. Records show Daniel Morse was still the sexton here in 1853. Again, he started in 1837. He was still the sexton here in 1853 and 1860, but in 1861, he is listed as a grocer operating a store together with Phoebe next to their home, which was over on Meeting Street. Daniel and Phoebe Morse had a son, Daniel Jr., and in 1865, they took in Susan Jarvis, a young woman who had been orphaned, and meanwhile, then the sexton here became a man named John Church, who was a friend of Mr. Morse, and he was also later one of the estate trustees for Daniel Morse's will. Records also show that Daniel Morse was very actively involved in anti-slavery causes in Providence and Rhode Island. He's a leader in the Anti-Slavery Society. He took part in the annual August 1st celebrations marking Emancipation Day in the West Indies. He also helped to incorporate the Second African Methodist Episcopal Church in Providence. This church had evolved out of the African Freeman Society in Rhode Island that was first founded in 1795, 1 year after that very first Bethel AME church was officially incorporated in Philadelphia. In 1820, the new Rhode Island AME church purchased a lot on Meeting Street that was very close to the Morse family's home and grocery store. And their church's construction was finished in 1866, 44 years after it was begun. By the time it was done, it had become a final destination on the Underground Railroad for people escaping slavery. 4 years after the church was completed, in 1870, Daniel Morse died, leaving behind his wife, son, and daughter-in-law, grandchildren, and good friends. There is provision for all of them in his will. But also, Daniel Morse's will shows the scope of his vision and commitment. It stipulates that eventually, when none of those named family and friends were still alive, the trustees were to transfer any remainder of the estate to the Second AME Church on Meeting Street that Daniel Morse helped to organize, so long as the church retained at least 10 members. And should the church fail, the remaining estate must go to Wilberforce University in Ohio, created by AME Bishop Daniel Payne in 1863 and named for the English abolitionist William Wilberforce. Wilberforce University was the first of the HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, to be established in this country. It is still thriving and still affiliated with the AME denomination, but they never received Daniel Morse's bequest because the Second AME Church here in Providence kept on keeping on. Do you remember that story I told you at the very beginning of this service? That strange sense I had that the creation of the AME Church belonged in our first history sermon, though I couldn't really fully justify it. Second AME kept on keeping on. Any church with the persistence to get built over 44 years is going to last. But things changed. And the Second AME Church on Meeting Street changed too. They became Bethel AME. And in 1961, they sold their property to Brown University and moved to Rochambeau Avenue, where they still are. They are the church we happen to be building a relationship, a friendship with. And their first lady, Licentiate Teresa L. Jenkins, wife of Pastor Howard Jenkins. I cannot resist adding that Teresa Jenkins happens to be a graduate of Wilberforce University. What an extraordinary sweep of time. Consolidation and division, generosity and avarice, heartbreak and resilience, severing and connection, evolution and cycles, all moving through human lives and relationships and history, so much that endured and so much that went up in flames, only to rise literally like a phoenix from the ashes, some people way ahead of their time and others way behind. So much we may recognize, not least that age-old tug of war between faith and deeds, or as we put it today, between spirituality and social justice, then as now so often seen as opposed rather than parts of a whole. So much is behind us, and so much is before us. Look around this space, this beautiful space we treasure, and we still treasure, though we have to know where so much of the money for it came from. And we have to know so much more is here than we will ever know. The stories for which there is no record, the people who fell in love here, the people who let each other down here, the people who stepped up, and the people who fell down, the people who took hold, the people who let go. Here, within these storied walls, under this extraordinary dome. Howard Jenkins said, "Knowing ourselves and each other means knowing our history." Who knew what we would learn? We have forgotten more than we knew. And we are learning now what this church could not let itself understand then. And this journey we are on today helps to define our past because it adds to what we understand about our past. Again, this journey we are on today helps to define our past because it adds to what we understand about our past. Our past does not define our present. Nor our future. What we do now is what defines our present and our future. May our faith and the ways that we live our faith now be a beacon that lights our way in these days, even a beacon our inheritors in this beloved community many, many years from now will be able to look back on and celebrate. May it be so. Amen. This is the time for our offering, and this offering is one of our special offerings that we do once a month to share resources with an outside organization with whom we share hope and vision for the world. And our collection today is for Incest Aware. Despite the progress of the Me Too movement, people still don't really talk about incest abuse, which is sexual abuse of children by members of their own family. As many as 10% of Americans are survivors of one of these most hidden forms of child abuse, and Incest Aware is committed to changing that statistic for the better. Created and led by 5 incest survivors, including our own Suzanne Alden, who is a member of this church. Incest Aware's mission is to be a resource on this topic. Incest Aware raises awareness of the epidemic of sexual violence in this family system. It provides resources to survivors and their loved ones along their healing journeys. It amplifies the voices of advocates like Suzanne who have chosen to transform their personal experiences with abuse into positive social change. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for your courage and your vision. Which is a world in which all people are safe from incest abuse. They've got a digital resource, which is the first website devoted entirely to the topic of incest abuse, and a lifeline for survivors, those who care about them and those committed to stopping incest and helping survivors heal. You can visit it to learn more at incestaware.org. But in the meantime, their work is making a massive difference in an area that is so hard to address. Please give as generously as you are able for this courage and this vision. And thank you so much for all that you give and all that you do and all that you are. Among the many ways we seek to live out our faith in these times and this place, I have these invitations for you. Our next Let's Talk About Race workshop is coming up on Saturday, April 9th from 2 to 5 p.m. in the church auditorium, the building across the way, with an option to attend online via Zoom. The first 2 workshops focused on learning some concepts to inform our anti-racism. The upcoming worship will focus on skills we can use to help us navigate conversations about race and connect across differences. As we look ahead to next year, we don't yet know what our next steps in anti-racism will be. What we do know is that the more of us who are equipped with these kind of skills, the more effectively we will be able to collaborate within our congregation and take action in the broader community. Even if you weren't able to attend the first 2 workshops, you are still welcome at the next one. You can call the church office to register or look for a link to sign up in this week's First U Times, and we all hope that you will join in. And members of the History Committee will be in the atrium after worship offering items for sale that are related to our 300th anniversary. And we have, of course, coffee hour without the coffee now. We're able to go back in and stay masked, but we're not having snacks and coffee. We're just hanging out and chatting and connecting with each other after the service, so everybody's welcome to head over there. And there are so many cool things at the History Committee's sale, so make sure to check it out. Don't forget to read the First U Times. It is sent to you every Friday afternoon with lots of important information you actually need to stay abreast of upcoming events and news. And visit the Book Nook, which is also there and reopened now, which has an amazing range of books. Our closing words come from 2 sources in keeping with the complexities of today and our service. T.S. Eliot, the great poet, was a complicated guy. He was born a highly privileged American Midwestern Unitarian who eventually renounced it all to become a highly bigoted and tormented English Anglo-Catholic. And still a poet of extraordinary power. I cannot cite him without acknowledging his many deep prejudices. But I also can't cancel him because he wrote something so piercingly true that to me it is gospel. From his poem, Little Gidding, what we call a beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started for the first time and know the place. But I'm giving the final word, which some of us have already heard from its resurrection this week in the judicial hearings, this excerpt from African-American writer and poet Langston Hughes's Let America Be America Again. And yes, his language is outdated and his vision is essential. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great, strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak, of profit, power, gain, of grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the ways, of satisfying needs, of work the men, of take the pay, of owning everything for one's own greed. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet and yet must be. Oh, yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath: America will be. Can we join in the words for extinguishing our chalice?
We carry the flame of peace and love and hope until we meet again.